What's up developers, it's Dari here, and welcome back to a new video where we will have a look at 8 bad habits that I see Laravel junior developers make. This video isn't made to bash anyone or to act like I know it better than you, it's purely meant to help you guys out in your careers. Also, this is my personal opinion. Everyone has their own take and there could be 100 bad habits, but these are 8 that I see often. Quick pause. I'm currently working on a new Udemy course where we'll dive into Laravel databases and Eloquent. If you think that there is a topic that should most definitely be included, feel free to drop it down below in the comments section. If you would be interested in the course or want to support the channel, make sure that you follow me on either Twitter, Instagram or YouTube to be the first one to find out when the course gets released. The 8 bad habits that I'm going to cover in this video have not been set in a particular order. Honestly, it's very difficult to order it anyways because in most cases there isn't a right or wrong. Just alternatives that might be better, but even that is debatable. Number 1 on the list is separating validation from controllers. In Laravel and many programming languages and frameworks, it is common practice to separate validation logic from controllers. There are honestly tons of reasons why separating validation logic from controllers is a good thing. One of the main reasons is to improve the maintainability of their code. By separating the logic, developers can make changes to the validation without impacting the rest of the code in the controller. This makes it easier to modify the validation code and update it as needed, without worrying about breaking any other part of the code. Another reason for separating the validation logic is to improve the readability of the code. When validation logic is mixed in with the controller's code, it can make the code harder to read and to understand. By separating the validation code, developers can make their code more modular and easier to understand. This can also make it easier for other developers to work with the code, as it is more clear and more organized. Finally, separating the validation logic can also make it easier to test code. Developers can create unit tests that focus specifically on the validation part. This can make it easier to identify and fix bugs related to data validation, without having to test the entire controller. So let's have a look at an example. Inside my task controller, I have a store method right here, which has one argument, and that's the request object. This object contains information about the request, such as the HTTP method, headers, and body. This can also be used to retrieve input data from the request, such as form data, query parameters, and route parameters. Through the request object that we have defined inside our argument, we're saying that the following incoming data should be validated. So the name, description, and priority. This feature is awesome, but it doesn't really belong here. In Laravel, you can separate validation logic from controllers using the request class. And the request class allows you to define the validation rules for a particular request, and then pass those rules to the controller. To use the request class for validation, you first need to create a new request class through the CLI. So right here, let's perform the PHP artisan make me something which is named a request. And let's name our request store task request. If we hit enter, you'll see that our request has been created successfully. So let's navigate back to PHP Storm because it creates a newly generated request directory inside our HTTP directory named request with a store task request class. Now if you open it, you'll have 2 methods. The first one is the authorize method, which needs to be set to true, which allows users to make this request. And then right below of it, we have a rules method, which is returning an array. Right here, you need to define the rules that we pretty much defined inside the task controller. So let's copy the name, description, and priority rules, and let's paste it inside the array. If we then navigate back to our task controller, we got to make sure that we put our store task request class to work by replacing the request class as an argument with the store task request class that we just created, where we then could remove the validation part that we're performing right inside of our store method, and Laravel will automatically validate the request before executing the method. If the request is invalid, so a name, description, or priority is missing, Laravel will return a response with the validation errors. The second bad habit I see quite often is not following the single responsibility principle, which is a programming principle that is part of the solid principles of software design. This means that each class should have only one responsibility or job to do. The idea behind the principle is that if a class has multiple responsibilities, it becomes harder to maintain and modify the code, which eventually will lead into bugs and errors. By following the single responsibility principle, you can create a more modular and flexible code that is easier to understand and maintain. It can also make it easier to test your code, as each responsibility can also be tested separately. Now let's have a look at an example where the single responsibility principle is not being implemented correctly. I have currently opened a auth controller which is located inside the auth subdirectory. Right here, you will see that the auth controller handles the login part of the application. It handles the registration part of the application, but it also has an edit, update, and delete method inside of it, which will handle the user profile management. So right here, it basically handles both the authentication part and the user profile management. To fix this, you could create separate controllers for authentication and user profile management. So let's do that. Let's navigate to the CLI and create 3 controllers. We're first going to create one which handles the login part. So let's say PHP artisan make me a new controller, and let's name it auth/authenticate user controller. Then we need to create a controller for the registration part. So let's say PHP artisan make me a new controller, also in the auth subdirectory, and let's name it verify email controller. Finally, we need to create a new controller which handles the profile management of a user, and there's no need to place it inside the auth subdirectory. So let's say PHP artisan make me a new controller, and let's name it profile controller. If we then navigate back to PHP Storm, we should refactor our auth controller a little bit. Now let's start at the top with the login method. So I'm going to copy it and I'm going to paste it inside the authenticate user controller because it doesn't belong right here. So we have a separate method which handles the login part. Then we have the register method. So if we copy that, we could basically delete it as well. Then we have our verify email controller, which handles the registration part. And finally, we have the edit, update, and the destroy method, which we could also copy, delete it, where we then have our profile controller, where we could place the profile management. By doing so, we could basically remove our global auth controller, because we don't need it anymore since the code has been separated in different controllers. Now by doing so, the code is a lot easier to maintain, but it also made it more modular and reusable. The third bad habit is not using middlewares or not using them correctly. I've touched on the not using middlewares correctly inside my previous tutorial as well, but I see a lot of developers making the same mistakes when it comes to middlewares. But I personally find it a bad habit to chain multiple middleware calls on the route. So as you could see right here, we have 4 routes, but they all implement the middleware auth. Right here, and right here as well. By doing so, your code can be difficult to read and to maintain. While middlewares can be very powerful for filtering incoming requests and processing data, it's important to use it right, and only when necessary. One alternative to using middleware chaining is to group routes together and apply middleware to the group as a whole. And this can make the code easier to read and to understand, as well as easier to modify and maintain. To group routes together, we can use the route group method. So let's define a new route right below of it by saying route : group. The group method allows you to define a set of routes and apply middleware to the entire group by passing in a key value bear as a first argument. So let's pass in an array where the key will be the middleware, while the value will in our case be auth, because the middleware auth has been implemented on all routes right here. Now in this example, we could basically paste all 4 routes that we have inside our route group by passing in a second argument, which is a callback function, and we could paste it inside of it. Quick add-on, you could add the prefix as an option as well by passing in a second key value pair where the prefix will be equal to the prefix of the first route, which is admin. So once we add it right here, all of our routes inside the root route have a prefix of admin defined. Overall, while middlewares can be a useful tool for filtering incoming requests and processing data, it's important to only use it when necessary. By grouping routes together and applying middlewares to the group as a whole, you can make your code more modular, easier to read and understand. Now number 4 on the list is not testing your code. And I don't really have an example for it, but testing code is an important step in the development process. Not only does it help you to ensure that your code works as expected and is free from bugs and errors, it can also play a critical role in making sure that your application is reliable and performs well under a variety of conditions. One of the key benefits of testing code is that it allows you to catch potential issues early in the development stage. This can save you tons of time and eventually money down the road, as it is much easier to address issues where they are caught earlier in the process. Besides, testing your code can help to identify areas where your code may be weak or vulnerable to certain types of input or situations. My recommendation: make testing a priority. Now, number 5 on the list is not using database migrations correctly. One of the biggest benefits of using database migrations is that they allow you to collaborate with other developers more easily. You can pretty much share your application or migration files with other developers who can then apply them to their own local databases. This makes it a lot easier to work together on a project, and it also makes sure that everyone is working with the same exact database structure. I see and hear way too often that developers create their database structure through a database client or PHPMyAdmin. Another issue of not using database migrations correctly is that it can make it harder to roll back changes if something goes wrong. If you're making changes to the database schema manually, it can be hard to undo those changes if you need to. With database migrations, you can simply roll back to the previous version of the database schema with one single command. Now, number 6 on the list is route model binding, where I have an example for as well. Route model binding is a feature in Laravel that allows you to automatically inject a model instance into a route's action, or a controller. This can make your code more concise and easier to read, as it eliminates the need to manually retrieve the model from the database and pass it into an action. Let's have a look at an example. Let's start off with the route since we already have it open, and in here we're going to define a route that will show a specific task of a user, which will be a GET request. The endpoint will be /tasks/route parameter of ID, and then we're going to send back a callback function. Now, the route parameter needs to be found somewhere, which can be done in the callback function, so let's pass in our ID, where then inside the callback function we could define a new task. We can set it equal to the task model, where we're going to find one specific task based on the route parameter that is coming from the URL. Now, once we have found our task, we could simply say, well, return a view to tasks.show and add the compact method because we're going to compact the task. Now, this could be done a lot easier with the help of route model binding. The ID parameter in the route corresponds to the ID column in the tasks table. Now, Laravel allows us to replace the route parameter ID with the task model, which will then search for a match inside the task table based on the route parameter that has been passed through, and it will get the entire instance, which will be set equal to our object task. By doing so, we could replace the Eloquent call to our database, since it has been done behind the scenes. And we could basically return back our task directly. This simply makes our code more readable, as you don't need to manually retrieve the model instance from the database in your route's action. It also makes your code more robust, as Laravel will automatically handle cases where the model instance can't be found or doesn't exist. Now let's have a look at another example, which is a more practical example inside our controller. Right here, you could see that it's grabbing the route parameter of ID, which we could set equal to our task model task object, which allows us to remove the call to our database. We could basically return back one specific task resource. Now, obviously, route model binding can be harmful as well, because it may not be appropriate in all situations. One example might be when you need to perform complex queries or joins that involve multiple tables. I personally don't think that route model binding is the best solution for it. In these cases, it may be used to manually retrieve the necessary data from the database and pass it into your route's action. Additionally, if you need to perform any validation or filtering on the retrieved data, you may want to perform these steps manually as well. Number 7 on the list is having bad naming conventions. One of the most common mistakes that developers make with migrations is not following a consistent naming convention. Migrations should be named using snake cases, and it should include a timestamp to make sure that they are executed in a correct order, which will be automatically added if you perform an artisan command. So let's have a look at an example. We could basically open our database directory, migrations, and simply creating a new file inside our migrations directory named create tasks table.php. But as you could see in the directory structure, compared to the other routes, it doesn't have a timestamp added to it. So what I always recommend is just creating migrations through the CLI, where we could basically say PHP artisan make me a new migration, and let's name it exactly the same. So create _ tasks _ table. If we then navigate back to PHP Storm, you will see that it has created a new migration for a task table, but it has included the timestamps. Another common mistake that developers make with controllers is not following the single responsibility principle, as I've mentioned before. Each controller should be responsible for a specific set of related actions and should have a clear and well-defined purpose. There is a debate whether controllers in Laravel should be singular or plural, but I always think that no matter which one you use, you should be consistent. Now, since controllers are also classes, they should be named using Pascal case. Personally, I think that you should always include the word controller at the end. So let's navigate back to the CLI, and let me perform a clear. And let's create a new controller through the PHP artisan make me a new controller. We're going to follow the Pascal case convention in a singular fashion, ending with a controller. So let's say post controller. Now, models in Laravel should also be using Pascal case, and they should be singular. Whenever you want to have a model that should work inside your post controller, you should perform the PHP artisan make me a new model named post. So singular and Pascal case. When designing your endpoints, it is important to name your endpoints in a way that is descriptive and consistent. Let's have a look at an example inside our code. Right here, you will find two endpoints. We have our song endpoint and article endpoint. My recommendations is to always keep these plural, so it should be named songs and articles. By using descriptive and consistent endpoint names, you can make your application more intuitive and easier to use for other developers. Consistent naming conventions can help you to make your code more readable, maintainable, and easier to understand. By following a consistent naming convention throughout your project, you pretty much make sure that your code is easier to navigate through, and that other developers can understand what each component of your code is responsible for. Finally, we have number 8 on the list, which is not using Eloquent in the right way. When using Laravel, it's Eloquent ORM. It is important to understand how to use it properly to avoid performance issues. One common mistake that developers make is not taking the time to learn MySQL properly before using Eloquent. And this happens due to people jumping way too fast into frameworks before learning PHP and MySQL. Now, Eloquent is a powerful tool for working with databases, but it's important to understand how it works under the hood. If you don't understand how database queries work in MySQL, you may end up writing inefficient queries that can slow down your application and cause other problems. Another common mistake that developers make is not taking advantage of Eloquent's built-in features and functionalities. Eloquent provides a number of powerful tools for working with databases, including relationship management, query scopes, and way more. By taking advantages of these features, you can write more efficient and effective queries, and avoid common performance issues as well. Topics such as eager loading are overlooked, which helps you to reduce the limit of queries that are executed against your database. Or even a topic such as query scopes, where you could write reusable query logic that can be applied to multiple queries. Finally, it's pretty important to understand the limitations of Eloquent and to know when and how to use other tools. While Eloquent is pretty powerful, it's not always the best tool for every job. In some cases, you might need to use raw SQL queries or other tools to optimize your database performance. Now let's have a look at a couple examples in using Eloquent the wrong way. And I recently started using a tool named Tinkerwell, and Tinkerwell is pretty much Artisan Tinker, but on a lot of steroids. It allows you to run code snippets without refreshing your browser. The first common mistake, and I've pretty much mentioned it already, is not using eager loading. If you don't use eager loading, you will define a new variable named tasks, you will set it equal to the task model, and you will get all values. Then you will probably try to loop over it somewhere in your application, over all tasks as one single task, and you will end up echoing out the task name. In the output, you will see that all names of our tasks has been printed out. Now, whenever you want to implement eager loading, you will reduce the number of queries that are executed against your database. It allows you to load related data in a single query, rather than making multiple queries for each relationship. We're going to refactor our query a little bit. We're still going to access our task model, but we're not going to change the all method because we're going to replace it with the with method. Now the with method is an Eloquent feature that allows you to specify relationships to load along the primary model. This will definitely help you to reduce the number of queries that are executed against your database, as it allows you to load related data in one single query, rather than the all method, which makes multiple queries for each relationship. So let's say that with our tasks, we want to have the relationship of user with it, and we need to chain the get method to it. Now what this will do is loading all tasks with their relationship of user, using only 2 queries instead of 1 query for each relationship. Now we can access our user as well by saying get me the task, user, and the username, where you will see that all 3 tasks have been created by me, which is code with Dari. The second mistake I see a lot of developers make is not using the select method to limit the number of columns returned by your query. Whenever you need to output 1 or 2 columns of an instance, there's no need to select all models and simply make use of 1 or 2 properties. Just to print out a name or task description, let's see how we could do this a little bit easier. Well, not easier, but better for our database performance. We're going to select all tasks where the priority is high, and then we're going to select the name with the description. And we're eventually going to change the get method to get all values. And let me actually align this a little bit. Then inside our loop, we can simply output one specific task, where you will see that we have only selected the name and the description. Now this could also be done without the select method that we have added right here. So let's delete it. But this will only be useful when you need to load related data with your primary model, because it reduces the number of queries executed against your database. When working with large data sets, it is crucial to divide the data into smaller chunks and processing them iteratively instead of processing the entire data set at once. This has a couple advantages. First, it can help avoid memory issues that can occur when attempting to process all data at once. Second, it can improve performance by allowing the process of smaller subsets of data, which reduces processing time. Smaller chunks of data makes it easier to identify and isolate errors that may occur during the process. So here's how it works. Let's get rid of everything that we have, and let's make a call to our task model, and we're going to access the chunk method. Now the chunk method accepts 2 parameters. The first one is an integer value of the number of tasks you want to get per chunk, so let's say 100, and we're going to add a callback function. Then we're going to set 100 chunks every time equal to a task variable, which we can use inside our call by adding a for each loop, which will loop over all tasks as one single task, and we could finally echo out one single task. I don't really have enough data inside my database right now to perform the chunk method and see where the benefits are, but it has basically divided the data into smaller chunks instead of processing them all with the all method. Now this was it for today's video, where we looked at common mistakes that developers make in Laravel. By following the best practices that we have talked about in this video, you can write more efficient, maintainable, and scalable code for Laravel. If you do like my content and you want to see more, leave this video a thumbs up, and if you're new to this channel, please hit that subscribe button.